Hello again, everybody. It's good to see you. And this is the third in our series on, well, really, apologetics, but we're giving it the overarching title. If Jesus is the answer, you'd better know the questions. So we're discussing in general terms the kind of arguments that Christians either make or have made in defense of Christianity. I suppose I should really introduce the fact that this is a foggy day on Olympus if you haven't come to us before. If you haven't come to us before now, and yes, that's a strange title, but it refers to the fact that we're attempting to give Olympian judgments on everything, just as the Greek gods are supposed to have done. But it's a foggy day up here because the reality is we're just living in the usual mess and fog of this world, just like everybody else. We're simply signaling our aspirations.
Yes, and as you said, today is our third episode in our series. If Jesus is the answer, you'd better know the questions. And we're calling this Faith's Strange New Defenders because some of these people who are sort of advocating for Christianity are not even Christians themselves. Is that right?
Yep. And we've shown you the faces of some of those on our title page.
They should probably look familiar to most of our viewers, I would suspect.
Oh, yes. And we will get to each of them shortly. Okay, so maybe we could start with this interesting meme I tripped across a few days ago, which certainly resonated with me. The gospel sounds very strange to a generation that's been told they're perfect. Loving themselves is virtuous. Their heart is always right, and nothing is more important than being happy. Now, of course, this isn't the whole story.
Yeah, we are living in a strange cultural moment, aren't we? I mean, if the Greeks in Athens thought that Paul was, kind of mad for talking about the resurrection of the dead, I feel like our contemporaries consider far more Christian categories to be ridiculous.
Yes, and just as he didn't get instant converts but needed to spend a little while talking things through with people, that's almost universally true now, of course. And it needs pointing out that what we've got, like most internet memes, the ones that aren't completely untrue, even those that are making a valid point, as this one is, they're certainly not the whole picture. Because the flip side of all of this is that we're living in a strange situation now where lots of people actually hate themselves, full of self-loathing, and often the kind of proclamation that one is perfect is covering up. Well, self-doubt is too weak a term, but actual, self-loathing. So we are in a very odd sort of moment indeed, I think.
So this episode is really to tack on to the two that we've just done. We're sort of looking at apologetics and some strategies for the best ways that Christians can go about relating and talking to and sharing their faith with other people.
Yes, but the very strange thing about this particular moment is that the lead is being taken by a load of people who either until very recently weren't Christians, and in many cases still aren't or are unwilling to commit themselves on the point. But I want to suggest that there is a new openness resulting from Western postmodernity's death spiral.
Yeah, and to remind people who have missed the previous episodes, can you talk a little bit more about what postmodernity we're meaning here?
Postmodernity is classically described in the quotation we gave last time as an attitude of incredulity towards meta-narratives, which means, very quickly, before we lose everybody and they run away, that postmodern Westerners tend simply to be disbelieving of any big theories about anything, not just Christianity, but any political theory, philosophical theory. They think that the world is far too irrational, scattered, broken up for any big theory to account for anything very much. And if recent centuries have been characterized by modernity and addiction to some of those big theories, whether it's, let's say, a belief in free markets or socialism or nationalism, these kinds of things, increasingly Westerners disbelieve in any of these kinds of things.
Right, and therefore very unlikely to believe in the kind of meta-narrative that the Bible would put forth.
Well, certainly, yeah. Certainly unlikely to accept a Christian big picture kind of approach, let's put it that way. Because, I mean, of course, you could argue that what we've got in the Bible isn't a big picture approach. That's something that modern Christians have extracted from it. What we've got in the Bible is a whole load of different histories, myths, wisdom, literature, apocalyptic, biography, letters, and so on. So, if you wanted to be a good postmodern person, you could say, well, actually, the Bible's on my side. but at least a retreat from, Christian big picture approaches. That's right.
Going back to your point, are we in a death spiral, as you're saying here?
Yeah, I think most Westerners feel, even if they wouldn't reach for that kind of phrase, that is the case. That their economy that seemed to be so perfect is no longer functioning and doesn't really show any signs of being able to get back to functioning the same way in the future. That they're running out of people, they're not reproducing themselves, and so they're facing population collapse. And the only way to fend that off is to have huge amounts of immigration, more than they like, the effect of which is transforming them culturally. There's huge anxiety, quite understandably, and I think quite rightly so, about climate change and global warming that threatens not just the economy, but a whole load of other things about the sustainability of living this kind of way. So I think, yeah. And then on top of that, something that I'd really want to stress here, and I think is most important for us today, more and more people, already a large minority, and as we're going forward, that's going to become a majority, are coming from dysfunctional homes and families where people don't know how to relate. And because of terrible domestic experiences, very often as children, actually have come away hating themselves. So in all of these respects, I think we are entering into a kind of a death spiral where Western societies simply cannot reproduce themselves into the future and are looking forward to certainly shrinking, possibly collapsing life expectancy and material expectations for the future, yes. So, but that does create the possibility, actually, of a new openness, as we're going to be exploring throughout this episode today. And Christianity has, just over the last 5 to 10 years, gained a number of new secular friends. And then there's the dilemma of whether or not Christians would be wise to embrace them. People, as we shall see, who have simply cried, stop, to the all-out assault upon religious faith, particularly upon Christianity, which has been launched by all of the major institutions in Western countries over the last generation. People who are saying, no, this is a bad idea, stop doing it. Christianity has given us all the good stuff, or most of the good stuff, that we've got. And we need to stop hacking away at that. So let's begin with perhaps the person who's most well known out of this tribe, Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, he's probably got to be one of the most well-known faces on the planet at this point.
Yes.
But is he even a Christian? Because I feel like he talks like it sometimes, and he's done a series of lectures on different books of the Bible, but it really seems like he hates to be tied down to an answer on this.
Right, he does. Famously, when asked point blank, do you believe in God? He has said that he hates being asked this question. He finds it so difficult, and you'd need to define it, and what does believe mean, because it would cost you everything, and all this kind of stuff. I found out a few days ago there was one interview back in 2017 where he did actually give a straightforward answer and said no. But that was also the year in which, when asked if he was a Christian, he said, well, the straightforward answer is yes. So,
Oh.
so conclude what you want from that. I suspect that the straightforward answer really is no, but that he would be a Christian in the slightly ironic sense that Dawkins has described himself as a secular Christian. That is, culturally so. But I could be wrong about that, and I would like to be wrong about that. Well, he's originally a Canadian clinical psychologist and a professor in Toronto. His book, 12 Rules for Life, was an international bestseller about 5 or 6 years ago. Due out this autumn is his book, We Who Wrestle with God, which enshrines actually a whole load of the stuff that you were just talking about a minute ago, where he gives these talks on interpretations of books of the Bible. Remarkable stuff that he comes up with, particularly when you consider that this text, more than any other that we know of, has been scrambled over and over and over and over for 2 millennia and more. And one would think that there was precious little new that was to be said that wasn't completely nuts, and yet he certainly managed that. So yes, he's one of these key figures who has, far from attacking Christianity, is actually defending it. Yeah. Well, let's come to this lady also, Louise Perry. She is someone else who's making a remarkable impact along these lines. Her background was as, let's say, a bog standard atheistic feminist, did women's studies in university, but then went on to do something really useful with that afterwards, working for an organization that helped survivors of sexual violence. But it was precisely that experience that led her to conclusions which to a previous generation would have counted as obvious, but seem radical or even heretical now. Until very recently, she remained an atheist, but is increasingly sympathetic to Christianity. In fact, her podcast, Maiden Mother Matriarch, which I'd recommend all viewers to listen into to various episodes, they're just brilliant, and looks particularly at women's issues. But there are no women's issues that don't affect men, or men's issues that don't affect women, I would maintain. But she actively promotes Christianity. Several minutes into each episode, she pushes people towards Glen Scrivener's introduction to Christianity on his podcasts, exploring the basics of Christian faith. Now, I'm not quite up to the minute on her as to whether she has actually made, the jump. She may have, I don't know, and perhaps some of our viewers will know. But she's another very interesting character. Her big splash, I suppose, into the public realm was with her book of 2022, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which sold very, very widely and continues to be extremely influential. Now, this is a little quotation from some of the early pages of that book. Today's female porn performers are far more likely than their peers to have been sexually abused as children, to have been in foster care, and to have been victims of domestic violence as adults. All misfortunes that Marilyn Monroe suffered too. She'd just been comparing the life histories of Marilyn Monroe, who died under mysterious circumstances in the 1960s, and Hugh Hefner, the guy who owned Playboy, and then, is it the Bunny Ranch, I think, or something awful like that out in Arizona, and died just a year or two ago. Ironically, they were born in the same year, so she lived less than half as long as he did. The libidinous public asks a lot of the women it desires, and when it all goes horribly wrong, as it usually does, this public labels these once desired women crazy and moves on. There's never a reckoning with what sexual liberation does to those women who follow its directives most obediently.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. And although I haven't read her book, I'm sure that I agree with a lot of what she has to say. I mean, it's, you really, she talks here about porn performers, but this is really something that has affected, women everywhere. I mean, whether it's just having these unbelievable beauty standards now that women have to live up to, or I think too, like you said earlier, there's sort of a distrust of men in general, because you don't know what they're up to, and the culture says it's probably not something good. So yeah, I think this is a big point that she's making here.
Right. I mean that kind of behavior by men is not in itself, well, how to put this? This attitude by men is not in itself something new. That's part of what it means to be a man. I am sad to tell you. But prior to the 1960s, all of this was heavily restrained by massive peer pressure. And also, women had far more protection from fathers and brothers and so on, and the way that society functioned. But in the more atomized
Right.
society that we're in now, women are without protection. Since universal contraception, the rather
Hmm.
obvious caution against extramarital sex has gone out of the window. And so that throws the burden onto women who find it much harder to say no. That the excuses that women have made down the ages, which always sounded, well, not necessarily really plausible, but they were at least theoretically plausible. What will people think? Or my father's going to, etc., etc. Right? That's no longer there, and so women are left exposed, and the restraints on the men have gone, and so that's a scary place to
Hmm.
be in. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I feel like, the effects of the sexual revolution have really led to this like sort of oxymoron, where women are told it's okay to be kind of fast and loose with all this stuff, and it's desirable to be that way. But then we're upset when men don't behave the way, chivalrously that we want them to. And so I think it seems a little silly to me, but
Right, right. One can get chivalry, but there needs to be the social base to support it. Whereas now, if anything, if you're a young man growing up today and you're tempted to be chivalrous, expect loads of withering remarks to come your way from both sexes, but particularly from women. But then they're the ones that actually lose when that's no longer there. So people want chivalry when they want it, but they don't want the
yes.
implications that go with it when they don't want it. Right. So it's that's not blaming women. The attempt to blame women as a category or blame men as a category is part of our disease. Right.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. We've simply lost the ability to cope with our differences, which previous societies have had. But that's not to idealize previous
Mhm.
societies either. Yeah. So she is someone who, as it were, has come full circle, and as she would certainly explicitly say that she thinks that the Christian social ethic was a very good thing and protected women, and laments the fact that that has been taken away. I'm not quite sure, like I said, whether she's actually made the leap and become a Christian herself. But if she either has, if someone wants to point that out to us in the comments on YouTube or something, or if she makes that step fairly soon, nothing would surprise me less. Yeah. Well, let's come to another character in some ways of the same sort, and it's this man, Tom Holland. He is a historian of the ancient world, very much a popular historian, right? He was quite a big name before he ever waded into debates around Christianity with his popular histories of ancient Rome and Greece and so on. And then he started to write about the Muslim world. And then that's seems to me to have been the thing that made him start to rethink finally Christianity. He says that he came from a Christian home and he kind of shook this off when he was in school and growing up and what have you. He was fascinated with the Greeks and Romans. They were pagan. He much preferred them. But the more he studied them, the more he didn't like them. And the more he realized that the values that he espoused concerning the importance of people looking after the poor and the vulnerable and so on, that this was to be found in Christianity and nowhere else. And then, while working for one of his books, he spent time in a town in Syria, which, as all of us know, has been racked by civil war now for more than a decade. He was in a town where ISIS had, just a few days before, crucified local Christians. And this made him rethink everything and start to completely reevaluate Christianity.
I think his story is so interesting because I feel like I've met tons of secular people who love Greek mythology.
Right.
It's a very popular subject, but how many of them, have actually looked beyond it like he did and came to these conclusions? Not that many, I don't think.
Probably not. Probably not. Yeah, certainly the Romans tended to be fairly pitiless. Just to take something completely ordinary, and I think we mentioned it maybe in one of the early episodes on early Christianity, the typical Roman attitude amongst the wealthy and the powerful was openly to despise those who were beneath them in the social pile. That was one of the ways that you emphasized that you were in a superior position. Now,
Right.
it's not that we're completely unfamiliar with that, but we know that we shouldn't do it. And if someone amongst us
Right.
should do that, we either think them a bad person or perhaps they're childish or insecure or something. But for the Romans, that was the ethos. And Holland discovered, well, that's not the way that I think people should be. I'm much more comfortable where we know that those who are more powerful have an onus upon them to look after those beneath them. So yeah, this is all part of what's getting him to rethink things. And the culmination of this direction of thought was, again, his best-selling books. I've shown it with two different covers here, so if people want to go and look this up online, they won't be put off by finding one and not the other. He says, even today, even though we're so secularized, that to live in a Western country is to live in a society still utterly saturated by Christian concepts and assumptions of the kind that we mentioned. And he uses the phrase the valorization of victimhood. And he wants to argue that, in fact, wokeness is that though it would vehemently reject religious belief and Christianity, it is a kind of stepchild of Christianity because it's taken the valorization of victimhood to a new level, if you like, and made it central to all of its political and social discourse.
Right. Yeah, I feel like this is like flipped this idea on its head because now you have it's almost like this competition of people who can collect the most victim points, right? Like who is the most oppressed. And then because of those characteristics, who can be put on the highest pedestal because
Right.
of them. And so it really is
Right.
like the Romans where
Mm.
you want to sort of look down on everybody beneath you, but it's like it's upside down.
Well, yeah, it's like the Romans upside down. But I think Holland's point is that this is itself, although it would be angrily anti-Christian, that whole direction of thought is derived from the very Christianity it rejects. Of course, it's taken it to an
Mhm.
absurd point. And yeah, as you say,
Right.
reintroduce the I'm better than you because I'm a bigger victim kind of thing. So it's very, very ironic. Yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, so he's one more person arguing in the same general direction. Christianity not bad, Christianity good. I think from stuff that I've heard from him recently, however, that because he spent several years teasing us all whether or not he was about to make the jump, and like some of these other people who's been going along to church fairly frequently. I think he's not going to jump. But I want to be wrong. Maybe he will yet surprise us all. But nevertheless, his book Dominion and loads of his public lectures and stuff that you can see from him online is nevertheless making this kind of argument. Moving on to the next of these figures, here is someone who has recently declared that she is a Christian. And this is Ayaan Ali, who is someone who's been in the public eye for at least a couple of decades, maybe more. She was raised in Somalia, which is the archetypal, totally dysfunctional, failed state, right? She was a radical Islamist as a teenager because that was what was around her, and she was recruited into that like loads of others, and realized through experience how terrible that was. Got away, managed to become an immigrant to the Netherlands, and became a member of parliament there and an advocate for the new atheism. So she was friends with Richard Dawkins and all these kinds of people, Christopher Hitchens and so on, and became known outside the Netherlands as one of these advocates for the new atheism. But the God she was rejecting was not the Christian gods so much. What she was focusing on was Islam and what she still sees as the dire consequences, particularly for women, but for people generally, of Islam. Well, she got married to the British, now we should say probably British American historian Neil Ferguson, and they live in New York. They've got a couple of kids, and she and her husband have started going along to church in recent years. She came quite near to a sort of mental breakdown, and she has recently declared herself to be a Christian. Have you been following this story at all, seeing her online or anything like that?
No, I'm sorry to say I didn't recognize her name.
Okay.
I'm living under too many rocks, apparently.
Okay, all right. Well, certainly it made pretty big news when she said that she was a Christian. But if one looks more closely at what she says, gosh, it really hurts me to say this, but I'm not sure that things are at all really clear in her own mind. Although she would probably agree that they're not clear in her own mind. She's still sorting it all out. But something she said in recent months suggests to me that she's not even clear on the God question. Well, if you're not clear on that question, then you're not really clear on everything else. And this
Right.
she says she chooses to believe the Christian story because she's found it so helpful in her own mental desolation. Because if you think about it, she's been uprooted at least a couple of times during the course of her life and lived through all kinds of upheavals. But it seems to me that allowing for the moment that her Christianity is Christianity, that it is, and certainly no one's doubting her sincerity. What we can say about all of these thinkers and some of the others is that their espousing of Christianity is kind of instrumental. They're instrumentalizing it because they can see that it is so useful and conducive to things that they value: people's mental health, the upholding of the dignity of the poor and of the marginalized, social cohesion, the things that have been inherited from the Christian past, and so on and so on. Well, this is all great, but it's not the same thing as actually believing this stuff and embracing it at a personal level. And one of the things I think that bothers me is that even though I'm quite enthusiastic about all of these people, is that Christians who have been pretty bad at rushing to embrace any big name that seems to be favoring them,
Right.
end up being disappointed in the future because things start to go wrong. Now, there's been a couple of high-profile people in the entertainment world who've declared themselves as Christians and have then gone on to have all kinds of disasters. You're going to have to remind me who those are.
Well, I don't know if he's had any disasters, but there was Justin Bieber was one of the big, it was a big hoopla when he started going to church.
Right.
But I think probably who you're referring to is Kanye West.
Right. Now, remind me, because I'm at least as lost on this as you are on Ayaan Ali. And maybe remind some of our viewers, because there could be people over 90 who are watching this as well.
Yeah, Kanye West is a rapper who had some pretty distasteful music before becoming a Christian, and then supposedly made this conversion and actually released at least one Christian rap album. But I think since then he's said quite a few enough things to rather upset some people since then. So
And to suggest that
it's hard to tell where he
he's no longer
stands.
doing the Christian thing. Is that right?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it's one of those what's the weather today sort of a
Well,
situation.
this is one of the conditions that afflict people in postmodern mentalities generally, that we are very, very given to fads and enthusiasms rather than embracing things for the long haul. The same, of course, is true of our relationships, but our lifestyles. I mean, the very term lifestyle is itself a creation of recent decades, right? It's like a choice.
Yes.
So yes, so yeah, if I remember correctly, I think loads of Christians started cheering immediately and far too soon. And I'm thinking of, who's that other similar British figure who's recently made a profession of faith? He hasn't done anything awful since, but I'm holding my breath. Russell Brand, that's who. Russell Brand, with somebody else with a, to say the very least, eyebrow-raising past, who has recently embraced Christian faith, and again, Christians have started to cheer a little too loudly and a little too quickly, and let us hope that it all goes well, and maybe it will. But let's not put him
Right.
front and center of everything that's happening, because that's not even going to help him personally.
No, right.
Okay, well, one more figure of the same sort before we get on to people who are absolutely, definitely long-time active Christians. Let's consider this person, Jonathan Haidt, American sociologist, lovely man. He perhaps first became really publicly prominent as co-author of a book a few years ago, The Coddling of the American Mind, which was grappling with the issue that younger people in particular can't face views that are different to their own, that they are, as the current expression now has it, triggered by all kinds of things. And he, rather than simply lampooning that or lambasting it, maybe that's the word I want, as so many people, particularly conservative type people, did, he tries to dissect it, to look at where this comes from, because he's not naturally a conservative figure. He would, I don't know, I would say, if I had to describe him, would be someone from the traditional liberal left, someone who's been left a bit high and dry by the rise of wokeness, but certainly wouldn't count as a natural conservative. His most recent book, just come out, I think, this year, is The Anxious Generation, in which he's moved on now to look at the effects on children and teenagers of smartphones and far, far too much screen time.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, and social media, I
social
think
media,
in
yes, yes,
particular, he talks.
yes, that's right. Yeah, as making kids anxious. Now, okay, you are not quite in that generation, but you are much, much closer to it than I am, and probably than more than 60% even of our viewers. So, have you seen this kind of thing going on amongst your near peers, not quite peers, but just the cohorts a few years below you?
Yeah, even being somebody that's not in that generation, if you're spending any amount of time on social media, I think like the problem is that you're just looking at all of these usually other people out there who are similar to you, maybe in the same stage of life, but they're doing something better than you are, or they look like they have their life all together in a way that you don't. And the point is that you feel like you have to measure up to these
Right.
standards that people online are putting out. Yeah, absolutely.
And I suppose the other side of that is because you are looking for, and the algorithms certainly help you to find people who are like you, that it's reinforcing the bubble effect, such that whatever your
Yes.
opinions are or your interests are, you tend to think that that's the world, and then you're either shocked or outraged when you encounter people who don't think that.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
I suppose one of my big beefs, because they bounce back, particularly as you say, in anxiety on those people themselves, is in raising ineducability levels. One thing that I found during the one solitary year that I spent teaching high school after I'd semi-retired from being a professor, I went and taught in a US high school for 1 year, and it was a revelation in a number of ways, but the only one I want to focus on right now. It explained to me why the last 2 or 3 year groups of freshmen that I dealt with when they came to college, why they were so difficult to teach. Not in the sense that they were bad people, but that they couldn't retain any information. And this was even more true of the kids that I found in high school, because these were the people who had not been given smartphones when they were 14 or something. These were people who had grown up with these. Right? Smartphones had been a thing since they were 6 years old or something like that. So they couldn't remember a time when these weren't there. And it had fried their brains. I was literally unable to devise tests that were simple enough that would not have the large majority of them failing. And when I say failing, I don't mean marginally failing, I mean catastrophically failing. So, yeah, Haidt is taking on all of the effects of this, but what he's particularly paying attention to is, of course, anxiety. Well, now, he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about religion. If I understand correctly, I think he comes from a basically secular Jewish background. But he's one more person who is certainly not inimical to religious faith and can see quite clearly the benefits that it has brought. So let's look at this little quotation from his most recent book. Strong communities don't just magically appear whenever people congregate and communicate. Now, you might remember that I was famous, or perhaps the word is notorious, in college for being the person who used the term community witheringly. Does this ring any bells with you?
Oh, yes.
Right, the college president tended to love this term, didn't she?
Yes. Yes, I think that's a common theme in a lot of churches nowadays.
Yes, yes, and we love it because it's kind of like a sunset term, because it doesn't really, well, as I would argue, it doesn't exist. Uh, for the real meaning of community entails two things that we don't have mostly. One is geographic contiguity, that is, living either in the same place or very closely alongside one another for a long period of time, and temporal
Mm.
continuity, that is, for our whole lifetime, or at least for a very large chunk of it. And almost nobody lives like that anymore. Traditional villages with very little change in population over generations, they lived like that. Monasteries and convents live like that. We live an atomized existence, mostly urban, constantly moving around. And Haidt, I think, I don't know whether he would quite go as far as me on this point, but he does at least go as far as saying you can't just say it's a community simply because people are gathering together for the moment. The strongest and most satisfying communities come into being when something lifts people out of the lower level so that they have the powerful collective experiences. They all enter into the realm of the sacred together at the same time. And when they return to the necessities of life, going out to work, shopping, cleaning house, whatever, changing the baby, they have greater trust and affection for each other as a result of their time together in the sacred realm. They're also happier and have lower rates of suicide. And again, all surveys bear this out, along with the fact that they're also more generous, by the way. In contrast, he says, transient networks of disembodied users acting asynchronously.
Sorry, in the common vernacular, that will mean...
Right. That means fleeting bunches of people, transient networks. You plug in when you like, you plug out when you like, is constantly shifting. Think about the fact, maybe, that even in a church which is supposed to embody the old values, it's very hard to predict who's going to be there on a given Sunday morning, right? Constantly in and out of disembodied users, and he's referring here more to the online experience. What's happening now, acting asynchronously. They're not all acting at the same time together. They're not synchronized because they can plug in and plug out when they feel like, because, hey, it's online. That just can't cohere the way human communities have from time immemorial. To enable their adherents to share collective experiences, religions mark off certain times, think religious services, but also religious festivals, places where they meet, and objects. Protestants aren't too keen on this, but Catholics and Orthodox are, and other religions are, as sacred. But what happens when social life becomes virtual and everyone interacts through screens? Everything collapses into an undifferentiated blur.
Wait a minute. Are we an undifferentiated blur? I mean, I suspect that one of us is, but...
Oh. Maybe we are. Or maybe it's just me. An undifferentiated blur, right.
Well, at least we have a title for you now.
Thank you very much. I think maybe with the intro, with a picture of you and me, we should zap Dr. Meic Pierce and put Dr. Undifferentiated Blur and Coil Campo. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
You're so good at affirming me. Right. But there is no consensual space. What he means by consensual space is where people are literally physically meeting together. That they're consenting to spend time in the same space. And that's not true in the virtual world. In the virtual world, there is no daily, weekly, or annual calendar that structures when people can or cannot do things. Right? Nothing ever closes, so everyone acts on their own schedule. So, for example, and it's painful to mention this, right? This podcast is going to go out at 9 p.m. Central European time, 8 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. East Coast time on Sunday, the 22nd of September, right? 2024. But anybody can watch it anywhere in the world at any time after that. Not just hours or days or weeks after, but 5 years later if they want to, should the world endure so long. So, yeah, there's... Everything's available to anybody all the time with little or no effort. There's no Sabbath, no holy days. Everything is profane. Think about the rather ordinary fact that we've got used to, particularly since COVID, that most church services are online. During COVID, they kind of had to be, right? And now they all have remained that way. So loads of people can go to church without ever leaving their living room or without ever meeting anybody else at all. And not even watching necessarily at the time of the service. Living in a world of structureless anomie makes adolescents more vulnerable into online recruitment to radical political movements, for example. And of course, he's thinking particularly of ultra-radical Islam, but it might be, far-right or far-left groupings, racist groupings, conspiracy theories, all this kind of stuff that offer moral clarity and a moral community that isn't there in the atomized existence outside of it, thereby pulling them further away from their in-person communities, which may scarcely exist anyway. So he's another secular thinker, again, who's looked into the kind of the moral and social and structural void that the postmodern West has created, is recoiling from it and saying, religious faith is a darn good thing. Well, let's come now to a couple of avowedly Christian thinkers. Elizabeth Oldfield is a writer and broadcaster. In her own way, a very postmodern kind of person, but nevertheless strongly embracing Christian faith and trying to find ways to communicate that resonate with people of her generation and younger. She says, we do see that Gen Z are much more likely to say that religion has got stuff to teach us about ethics. Now, one of the things that Christians have been beating the drum about for a long time now is, if atheism is no basis for morality. That's probably true. And certainly secularists have been saying, you can be a good person without being religious, and so on, to which the pushback is, well, define good, and then tell me what the basis is for defining that good. Now, the debate has swung backwards and forwards, and we're not going to get into that one now. But nevertheless, it's clear that the net effect of ongoing secularization is to leave people with no real basis for defining the good other than screaming assertion. And what she's putting her finger on is that Gen Z, even people among them are not necessarily very educated or very clever, nevertheless, at a visceral, a gut level, can see that and feel that and sense that religion has got stuff to teach us about ethics. There's an openness. However, I don't think the church knows what on earth to do with those people, right? The church can just about cope with its own young people who've been brought up in hopefully nice Christian homes, where it's spent their whole childhood trying to inoculate them against the bad out there. But what do you do with the tattooed, earringed, nose-ringed person from the dysfunctional home who has finally seen that there is something here, they're not sure what it is, but they're desperate, they think there's something, they've come in, and most churches just do not know what to say to them or how to approach them. And it's quite hunkered down and high anxiety itself, because it's feeling the pressure of the world around it, which is hostile to it. A lot of Christians are not able to meet those questions with curiosity and openness. We're more addicted to the pre-packaged kind of, this, and this, the four spiritual laws, the journey into life, or if not that, the kind of discourses that we got from the likes of Schaeffer on the one hand or Josh McDowell on the other, which worked in the 1960s and 70s and probably 1980s and don't now. And there's, in any case, a huge values gap over sexuality, where even to begin.
So basically, she's saying we need to come up with a new way of doing apologetics.
Yes, we do. And I want to make a suggestion about that at the end. Something that is so pregnant with ideas that we may even need to do a whole fresh series on it in a few months. But we've got to leave people dangling maybe a little at the end. But let's see where this goes. Well, first off, let's start with a really delicious quotation from her. There's very good evidence that we come to our conclusions about things based on the relationships that we're in and the people that we trust and the story that makes sense to us. Now, that last bit, the story that makes sense to us, it's almost touching base with the better elements in Schaeffer's view. The story that makes sense to us is the story that seems to answer the questions that actually exist for us as people. But in the high anxiety generation that we're in now, those questions will be a bit different, and they'll be a bit less philosophical than the ones that Schaeffer obsessed about. Right? There'll be, do I matter? Who the heck am I? How can I escape? Never mind the cosmic or the philosophical void, just the social void of not belonging anywhere or belonging to anyone. And that's where the relationships thing comes in, and the people that we trust, because we are now in a very, very low trust society, because more and more of us have got fractured relationships, and that has keyed us into ways of behaving that more or less guarantee that future relationships will fracture as well, which just reinforces the same view. It's a downward spiral, right? Now, this is part of what we meant by the postmodernity's death spiral. Once you get into this, it drags you further and further down. Right? Just like the demographic collapse, once you start to spiral downwards, it becomes a huge act of will to say, well, I'm going to act differently and have 3 or 4 kids. Right? Because everything financially, socially, and in a whole load of other things militates against that. Okay, well, finally, let's come to this fellow, Glen Scrivener, lovely chap, a Christian apologist. He's from Australia, but he's based in the UK and has been for, I don't know how long, but quite a long time, certainly a decade, maybe more. His books include The Air We Breathe, which is it's a Tom Hollandish kind of argument that the things that we value most, even as aggressively secular, anti-religious people in Western societies, actually come as the legacy of Christianity. So it's saturating everything. That's what he's looking at there. And 321 is looking at how we understand Christian faith and as an introduction to some of its central ideas. And he says something very interesting. He says it's not so much that we think our way into a new way of living as that we live our way into a new way of thinking. Now, that's, again, almost touching base with the quotation that we started with from Austin Farrell about 2 episodes ago, where he says, well, not many people get reasoned into Christian faith, but that doesn't mean that apologetics is unimportant. Quite the opposite. It's very important. What nobody shows an ability to defend, people will eventually abandon, right? And he's agreeing with that. But he's saying, but we don't think our way into this. On the contrary, we live our way into a new way of thinking.
Kind of like this idea saying that like the habits that we keep have some kind of effect on our mental state. Like you have to start a new habit first and go through the actions of performing this new habit before it will actually have any effect on your mental state.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Now we are not helped in coming to terms with this fact, actually, and boy, is this going to be pressing a sore spot for a lot of people, perhaps particularly for evangelicals. We are not helped in this fact by the radical dichotomy between faith and behavior generated by the Reformation doctrine of justification by faith. Now, I would point out here, and again, this is going to hurt some people. Okay, here we go. The doctrine of justification by faith is not formulated as a doctrine until we get to Luther. The fact that I think we have all experienced, that what you believe, whatever it is, whether it's Christianity or anything else, what you believe is generally shown through how you live. And the way that you act shows what you really believe, which may not be the same thing as what you say you believe. So the two things are actually totally bound up together. And that, I think, ties in very nicely with the way that Glen Scrivener is making the point here. That the whole thing is actually, it's like a self-reinforcing spiral, if you like, or circle, right?
Yes.
Now, I don't know, does that chime at all with processes that you might have witnessed of people becoming Christians in your own generation in recent years? That people have come in, they're not at all sure, they slowly become part of a church congregation, they have a chance to talk things through, they slowly start to change their lives, and the whole thing kind of interconnects like that. Would that be true of what you've seen?
Yeah, I think so. I wish it were that straight of a line, but I
Well,
think
yeah, I'm saying it's not a line.
in
Actually.
general.
I'm saying it's like a kind of a spiral, or a turning circle, if you like.
Yeah, yeah, like you would change some things in the beginning, and then and then maybe go back, take a few steps backwards and then forwards, and yes.
Yes, yeah. And I think what Glen Scrivener is saying is, particularly among Gen Z and the rising generations, this is how things are particularly likely to work.
Yes.
And I suspect he's right. Okay, well, to finish, or nearly finish, with some ideas of my own, or reflections at least of my own. And what I want to do here is to make some vast generalizations about the long run of Christian history. As you know, I am a church historian. That's my original and still main discipline. And what will be true about Eastern Christianity, Eastern Orthodox theology, has emphasized the doctrines of the incarnation, the idea of God becoming a human being in the person of Christ, taking on flesh, and the resurrection. Now, it's not that it's not interested in all of the other classic Christian doctrines. Of course, that's not the case. It's interested in all of them. But if you look at Eastern Orthodox writing and preaching, but even more, it's iconography, it's art, right? Those are where the emphasis lies. And it's produced a mindset that is open to mysticism, and that is resistant to materialistic or reductionist logic.
So we're not saying that Eastern Orthodoxy doesn't accept all of the other key teachings, just that it's paying special attention to the incarnation and the resurrection.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And then somehow this emphasis produces a mindset that's open to mysticism, like you said, and resistant to materialistic or reductionist logic.
Yeah, and that's because the incarnation and the resurrection, one thing they have in common is that they're not rationalistic. They're both emphasizing that the spiritual and the physical can unite in a way that is very difficult to define. It's almost like a black box, as it were. And I must admit, I sometimes have been tempted to what some people might consider blasphemous laughter at reading the strenuous attempts that we see, for example, in the Chalcedonian Creed, to get inside that black box. It doesn't work. And that actually, in the long run, has produced a mindset open to mysticism. It's not that you don't get mysticism in Western Christianity. Famously, you do in the late Middle Ages in the Catholic Church, and even certain kinds of Protestantism. But it's pronounced right through Eastern Orthodoxy, and it's much more resistant to modernist kinds of materialist or reductionist logic. On the other hand, Western theology, Catholic and even more Protestant, has emphasized personal sin and the crucifixion and the atonement. And again, I would just say, for evidence of which, just look at their preaching, just look at their art. where it focuses. It's not that it's not interested in the incarnation and the resurrection, it certainly is. Right? It's a mirror image situation here. But it's where it places its emphasis. And in the long run, that's produced a mindset inclined to individualism, stressing your relationship with God personally, but also your individual career and its wants and stuff like that. And also to legal abstractions, imputed sin, imputed righteousness, justification by faith. And in Reformed theology, things like covenantal headship and stuff like that. And that way of thinking saturates Catholic and Protestant derived societies, even affecting something like economics. Take something like the legal personhood of a company or a limited liability corporation. The idea that a company can be treated in law like a person, that it can sue and be sued, for example. I mean, where on earth outside of a Protestant, probably Reformed background could such a way of thinking possibly have arisen? Nowhere. It comes out of that.
Right.
What I want to suggest is, okay, there are those two big traditions. What we're in now is a completely unprecedented situation. As we've seen throughout this episode, quite a lot of the apologetics is being done by people who aren't even Christians, or at best are teetering on the brink. But a totally degraded culture in which a large minority, and with the passing of time, even a majority of individuals, hate themselves because of abuse in their past or their present, because of their chaotic homes and family backgrounds, feel rage against others and against society as a whole. And you only have to spend time, I don't know, on a college campus or with a bunch of teenagers to sense that. And who repudiate their historic heritage as either repressive or at best irrelevant. Those people, I want to suggest, will respond best to an emphasis on the Christian idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that despite everything, that they matter.
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, we're all trying to gain value from the things around us, whether it's people that we hang out with or clothes that we buy, things like this. And so, but the stamp of approval that we get from these things is really only a temporary, existence. And it's exhausting to try to keep up with that. And so, yeah, I think the newest generation, the kids are already seeing, this is kind of an emptiness that the world can provide to them. And so that leads them to this kind of despair that you were talking about earlier. But that's why I think what you're saying here is such a powerful proposition for apologetics, because you're talking about people gaining value from a higher being, which is such a hopeful prospect, because it's a permanent stamp of approval, and it's not influenced by anything that we can say or do about it.
Yes. Because as you say, simply trying to gain validation from other people or through the things that we buy or the clothes that we wear is pretty empty. That's something that I think Westerners have been increasingly aware of even since, I don't know, the 1980s. But what we're seeing now is, well, on the more benign side, people wanting to insist that I'm valuable, I'm precious, my life matters. And, you see all these internet memes and, you're important regardless of who you are. Blah, blah, blah. But on the negative side, the kind of rage-filled assertions, how dare you not validate me and my choices, or me and my chosen identity, and all the rest of it. Okay, but never on both sides, nevertheless creeping back to the awareness that this is all incredibly empty, because there's nothing, literally nothing, underpinning it. And
Yeah.
what the Christian assertion that people matter because they're created in the image of God, that is an undergirding. Now, it comes at a price, of course, because it means that you can't do whatever you want to do. And it means that you can't simply assert that you are whoever you want to be, even if that flies in the face of the facts. But it is nevertheless a kind of like a huge reward. It's a realization that you actually matter in spite of everything.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think this has implications for the people around us too. Like it's a way to gain value as an individual, but it's important that we see the people around us as having value also, because I think, like Haidt was saying, everyone is feeling more and more isolated with the internet, and especially after COVID now. And so it's much more meaningful if the people around us have value also. There's so much more reason to interact and engage with them.
Yes, yes. And as with all apologetics, it's a way of engaging people on the basis of something that is solid and real, but of course is not the whole story. It's just the start, as we've tried to emphasize, throughout this series. Maybe that's the hook or the way in to engage,
Mhm.
and then you bring in all of the other stuff as well.
Right.
So yeah, that would be certainly my big suggestion. I've found after talking with a number of audiences about that. Yeah, there's a lot of people resonate with that, and it seems to chime with what's happening with a lot of churches and people who have fairly recently become Christians and so on. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I feel like this has been a mammoth of an episode, but hopefully our viewers gained some interesting knowledge for it. So we hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Thank you very much for being with us, everybody, and talk to you again soon. Bye bye now.